Inside a church in Axum, Ethiopia, there is a manuscript that names the Fathers. It sits in a cedar chest inside the treasury of a building most people will never enter, part of a collection that has not left those walls in over 400 years. Written in Jez on parchment, it contains the full Book of Enoch, and in its opening chapters, it does something no book left inside the Bible does. It gives the roster, not sons of God in the vague, unnamed language of Genesis, names, ranks, account, and a list of exactly what each one taught the human women they took. Church leaders removed this book from the record at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, banned it, called it dangerous. For most of 17 centuries, in the West, it was simply gone. And then in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced at Qumran, and among them were 11 separate copies of Enoch, more copies than most books that stayed in the Old Testament, older than nearly anything around them. The book the council erased was one of the most copied texts the community owned. And here is what it actually says. Enoch does not describe the Nephilim as a legend. He describes them as the product of a specific event carried out by a specific group of 200 beings who bound themselves by an oath on a named mountain before they ever came down. Not a myth, not a metaphor. He names the leader, he counts the ranks, he lists what they taught, and he records the bloodline that came out of it, and what happened to the spirits of the children when their bodies died. In the next several minutes, you will see what the text says about that bloodline, what modern genetics has quietly confirmed about an unknown lineage inside human DNA, and why access to the oldest manuscripts has been restricted since 1974. If forbidden history fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from the record. But here's what makes this stranger. The account does not sit where you would expect a legend to sit. It sits in chapters 6 through 8 of the Book of the Watchers, the oldest layer of the entire Enoch tradition. The Aramaic fragment, cataloged as 4Q201, held in the collection from Qumran Cave 4, preserves this exact section, and its script has been dated by its editors to the late 3rd or early 2nd century BCE, older than any text in the New Testament. The Ethiopian GES manuscripts at Axum preserved the complete version, the one R.H. Charles worked from for his 1912 Oxford translation, still a standard reference. 2 witnesses, 1,000 years apart, agreeing on the roster. The level of detail is wrong for ancient literature. Apocalyptic writing deals in symbols, beasts with 10 horns, numbers that mean kingdoms. It does not stop to give you an administrative headcount. But chapter 6 does exactly that. It is written in the first person and the past tense. It names a location you can stand on today. It gives a number that reads like a muster roll. And it records an oath sworn as a binding contract with a penalty clause. This does not read like prophecy. It reads like the minutes of a meeting. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 3 parts: the gathering, the teaching, and the bloodline that would not die. Walk them in order, and the reason the church buried this book starts to come into focus. Chapter 6 opens the record. The text says, "The sons of heaven saw the daughters of men, desired them, and their leader, named in the manuscript as Semjaza, said to them that he feared to act alone, that he alone would bear the penalty. So they swore an oath together, all of them, binding each one to the act, so that no single one could be blamed." The surface reading is a story about angels wanting women. But read the mechanism. This is a conspiracy, structured to distribute liability. 200 of them, the text says, descended in the days of Jared onto the summit of Mount Hermon. That is a real mountain, Jabal al-Sheikh, on the border of modern Syria and Lebanon, over 9,000 feet. The GEs even preserves a pun. They called it Hermon. The text says, because there they swore the oath, and the Aramaic root for oath, herem, is the same sound. He is not describing a spiritual location. He is telling you the name of a peak and why it carries that name. He had no reason to geolocate a myth. He gives you coordinates anyway. But the text doesn't stop there. Chapter 6 does something no legend needs to do. It names the officers. It gives 20 leaders of the 200, each one over a unit of 10. Semjaza, Arakiel, Kokabiel, Barakiel. 20 names, ranked, counted. This is the part symbolic literature never contains, because symbols do not have payrolls. He wrote down a chain of command. What follows in chapter 8 is stranger still. The text turns to what they taught, and it is oddly specific. Azazel, it says, taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and taught them metalworking and the metals of the earth. He taught the making of bracelets and ornaments, the use of antimony, the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones and dyes. Others taught enchantments, the cutting of roots, astrology, the courses of the moon. The mainstream reading calls this a myth explaining where the arts came from. But look at what is actually on the list: metallurgy, weapons fabrication, cosmetics and pigments, pharmacology of roots, the reading of the sky. This is not a list of sins. It is a technology transfer. He is describing the sudden arrival of metalworking and applied chemistry as a single cataloged event, attributed to named instructors. He had no framework for the Bronze Age as a technological rupture. Yet the list he gives is exactly the toolkit of that rupture. And then comes the part that shouldn't be possible: the bloodline. Chapter 7 records that the women bore children to these beings, and the children were giants. The GEs gives their height in a number so large it is clearly the language of catastrophe, not a measurement. But the detail that matters is not the size. It is what the text says happened when they died. Chapter 15 records that the spirits of the giants, because they were born from a union of two natures, would not go down into the earth like human dead. They would remain on it. The text says they became evil spirits on the earth, and that they afflict, oppress, and lead astray, and that they will do so until the day of judgment. The bloodline, in other words, did not end at the flood. The bodies ended. The line, the text insists, continued in another form. He is describing an inherited condition that outlives the individuals who carry it. He is describing a lineage that persists after its founders are destroyed. Here's what the translators left out. The standard English editions render the founders' status simply: they fell, they sinned. Clean moral language. But the Aramaic and the Ge'ez use a title the English flattens. These beings are the Irim, the Watchers, and the word does not mean the fallen. It means the wakeful, the ones who do not sleep, the ones who keep watch. Charles renders it Watchers and moves on. But the older word carries the sense of a posted sentry, a being assigned to observe and not to intervene, who broke the assignment. That reframes the entire event. This was not a fall from grace in the abstract. It was a dereliction of a specific duty by beings whose one job was to watch. The text moves on, but the implication sits there. The corruption of the human line was not committed by strangers. It was committed by its assigned guardians. And there is a second omission: quieter and stranger. Chapter 7, in the fuller manuscript tradition, does not describe the offspring as a single kind. It describes a sequence. First, giants. Then, from the giants, a second category, the GEs, separates out. And then, a third. 3 tiers of descent, each further from human, each named distinctly. Western summaries collapse all of it into the one word Nephilim. The manuscript is describing a graded bloodline, a thing that dilutes and changes as it passes down, not a single monstrous generation. He is describing inheritance across generations, degree by degree, not one event, a line. What modern readers don't realize is how closely this matches what genetics has actually found. For most of the last century, the human family tree was drawn as a single trunk. Then, beginning in 2010, sequencing of Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes proved that anatomically modern humans interbred with other, now vanished human populations, and that everyone outside Africa carries a small percentage of that archaic DNA to this day. Interbreeding between separate branches of the human genus, leaving a permanent genetic signature. That was already the shape of the Enoch account. Two lineages that should not have mixing, and leaving a trace that outlives the parents. But the parallel got sharper. In 2020, a team led by researchers using an algorithm called ArgWeaver-D, publishing in the journal PLOS Genetics, reported that roughly 1% of the Denisovan genome was itself inherited from a population no one has ever found. An unknown, deeply diverged, archaic hominin, a ghost lineage, with no bones, no fossil, known only by the mark it left in the DNA of others. And about 15% of those ghost segments were passed onward into modern people alive today. That same year, a separate study of 4 West African populations reported that between 2 and 19% of their ancestry appears to come from another undiscovered archaic hominin, one that split off before Neanderthals existed. The text describes a bloodline from an outside lineage that persists in the living long after the founders are gone. The science found segments of an unidentified lineage that persist in the living long after the source population vanished without a trace. The parallel is not metaphorical, it is structural. Enoch called it a bloodline that would not die. Geneticists call it a ghost. Both are describing the same thing. Genetic material from a population that is no longer here, still riding inside people who are. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, where the book was left out of the canon and its use discouraged. But the objection to these chapters specifically was never only about doctrine. It was about specificity. A book that gives named beings, a real mountain, a head count, and a bloodline is a book that makes claims which sound like history. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed Enoch as apocryphal and unreliable. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410, argued directly against reading the sons of God as these beings at all, and pushed the interpretation toward a purely human genealogy, the line of Seth. The named roster was inconvenient, so the reading that erased the roster won. The Ethiopian Church, outside Rome's reach, kept the book whole. When the Scottish traveler, James Bruce, carried 3 GI's manuscripts back to Europe in 1773, the chapters on the Watchers drew immediate controversy, precisely because they read as an account of hybrid descent rather than allegory. 19th century scholars treated the bloodline passages as embarrassing folklore. The pattern is consistent across 14 centuries. The more the text reads like a record, the harder the institution worked to reclassify it as a story. Now, here's where it gets active. Access to the oldest and most complete manuscripts the GES tradition held at Axum was restricted after 1974, when the Ethiopian Revolution brought a government that reclassified church archives as protected national cultural property. Direct examination of certain manuscripts in that collection has not been generally available to outside scholars in the decades since. Passages known to specialists only through older secondary references have not been re-examined against the originals. The physical books that carry the full roster and the graded bloodline are behind stone and behind a state, and the people who most want to read them, line by line, have spent 30 years being told no. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying 200 named beings landed on a mountain in Lebanon and engineered a hybrid species, and that geneticists have found their DNA. The Book of Enoch is not a lab report, but what the text describes, when you read it carefully, keeps matching what the record keeps turning up. A separate lineage entering the human line. Descent that changes by degree across generations. A founder population that vanishes while its genetic trace persists in the living. A book older than the Gospels, naming that outside lineage as the origin of something that would not die out. He had no genome sequencing. He had no concept of an archaic hominin. He should not describe inherited descent from a vanished population that survives in people long after the founders are gone. And yet, the text sits there, in Ge'ez and in Aramaic, in fragments pulled from a cave at Qumran, saying what it has said for over 2,000 years. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the human line really did absorb genetic material from separate, now vanished populations, if some of those populations left no bones and are known only as ghosts inside our DNA, if that inherited material genuinely persists in the living today, and if a text older than the Roman Empire describes exactly that, an outside lineage entering the human bloodline and refusing to die, in plain first-person language with a named roster, then the text is not mythology. It is documentation. Enoch went somewhere, or was shown something, and he wrote it down with the same flat tone you would use recording names in a ledger. Semjaza, Azazel, 200, sworn on the mountain. What he describes is either a symbol we have misread for 2 millennia, or it is exactly what he says it is. The manuscripts remain in Axum, behind stone and behind a government seal. Fragment 4Q201 sits in the Qumran collection, its Aramaic naming the leaders in ink older than the Gospels. The genome data sits in laboratory servers, the ghost segments flagged and unexplained. And in a book the council removed from the record 17 centuries ago, a man named Enoch writes down the roster of the fathers and records that the line they started did not end when their children fell. The names are still there. The bloodline, the text insists, is still here, and the ghost inside the genome is still being read exactly the way Enoch said it would persist. The next investigation is on screen now. Keep watching.